Hey folks, so today we're going to be covering a pretty straightforward topic in terms of implementation. This is ads in games. Uh, Whilst the initial implementation is relatively straightforward, actually refining and kind of fine tuning your ad placement is a little bit more tricky. So, first thing I'm going to be covering is why choose ads over premium, the process of doing it within Unity, suggestions for kind of other mechanics to kind of get people to engage with the ads, and then some kind of other tricks and suggestions I've picked up along the way. So, the first one is kind of the question of why choose ads. Quite a few people will have kind of a visceral reaction to ads as an option. There is an understandable stigma associated with them because of like a lot of really nasty anti-consumer practices by studios just absolutely cramming their games full of ads. And yeah, just kind of whilst in the short term probably making a decent amount of money, but in the long term alienating their audiences. So that is completely understandable. But one thing that we have to kind of realize and accept is that ads are kind of normalized as like the predominant way of generating revenue from online traffic, and not just online. If you go to the cinema, let's say you play your little Flappy Bird game and an ad pops up and you're like, ugh, I don't want to see anything, any media with ads in anymore. I know, I'll go to the cinema. You see ads before the film starts, and then you see trailers, which are ads for other films. You leave the cinema and you go to the news agents. You pick out a newspaper or a magazine. Ads in those. You go on your phone. There's ads on every website. There's ads on every social media platform. There's ads on TV, and even things like the BBC. Even though they are technically ad free, they do have advertisements for their own programs. So, yeah, like ads are pretty much normalized in every other medium except this kind of one bastion where we kind of don't expect them to be, which is video games. So, yeah, I would encourage you to be a bit more receptive to the prospect of putting ads in your games. The audience has already adjusted. It's kind of more people that have grown up being used to not having them in there that are kind of so resistant. Some kind of actual perks to having ads-based games instead of premium games. The first one is if you kind of win big, so to speak, and get like a storefront feature. So let's say you get the Apple front page feature. That's really good. If you're a premium game, you get your first week of exposure, but then when the feature ends, that's it. Like it cuts off. You might be, if you're that popular, you might get on some other charts, but in general, your revenue will kind of dip. Compare that to ads, where your revenue is generated from your audience. So even though the game has stopped being downloaded, people are still playing your product. So you will still generate revenue in that, and you'll get less of a kind of sharp drop and more of a kind of curve or more of a tail. So another thing as well, leading off of kind of the normalization argument, you know, it's premium games are pretty much like either a dying breed or extremely hard to sell on mobile. The fact that Apple Arcade, produced an entire platform to sidestep having to buy games, and to try and push back against the free to play market, and failed. Like realistically, their most successful game out of that program was a free to play game. Even though it's not technically a free to play game, Grindstone is, people are engaging with free to play titles rather than kind of bespoke indie narrative stuff, which is sad, but realistically, it's what the market wants. So it's much harder to make that sell, and it's weird because realistically, if we're dealing with Cambridge, for example, it's a fiver for a pint at a pub, which is ridiculous because you're only getting like 5 minutes of pleasure out of that pint, or maybe 6 hours if you include the alcohol. But realistically, for that £5, you could buy like 3 to 5 games on mobile and have in excess of 20 hours entertainment, which is or even more. So it is weird that there's that kind of mismatch there, but yeah, unfortunately, it's the way it is. People aren't willing to pay for them. Having said that, though, one thing that is also useful is that from the legal side of things, you won't have to worry about your game being pirated, because if it's a free game, why would anyone want to pirate it? So that's quite useful. You don't have to worry about people pilfering your game. So in terms of integration in Unity itself, it's relatively straightforward to kind of do that initial integration. So you need to go to the package manager and install the add package, and then from there you want to go to Window, General, and Services, and that'll kind of add a side panel, this panel here, to your interface. If you haven't already, you'll need to create a user ID, for Unity services. That will allow you to kind of access your what's it called account, your Unity Unity ads account, and then from there you just need to create a project ID. The project ID is basically how you kind of direct Unity's services to your project, and for the inverse, how Unity directs its revenue to your to your bank account, basically, or at least from the game, knowing what to provide for your bank account. From there, anyway, once you've got those two things sorted, you need to enable ads within the interface, and then enable test mode as well. So for the purposes of this module, I'm not expecting you to kind of fully integrate commercial ads. The test ads will be just fine. I'm perfectly happy with you just using test ads for now. You can obviously go ahead in your own time and implement that if you want, but I'm fine with just the test ad integration. So if we move on from there, in terms of setting up your specific adverts, I'm going to be just talking about interstitial adverts, the banner adverts, if it's relatively easy to do, but I'm not going to focus on it that much. Sorry. So the first thing you want to do is you want to figure out where in your game the initiating event of showing an ad is going to happen. So, for example, do you want it to, do you want to be a scumbag and show it the moment the game boots up? Do you want to place it when the character dies? Do you want to place it when the character wins? Think about when you want the advert to play, and where they're kind of most likely to see it. Usually the places I put them is either on the win or the lose states. Those kind of two events aren't too disruptive to gameplay, and depending on depending on how frustrating or how quickly your game is for rounds, that seems to be accepted by most people. So then from there, what you need to do is you need to put this piece of code at the top of your script that you're creating you need to create a script and then put this at the top, which is the using Unity engine.advertisements block. That'll just kind of you'll be able to reference the package that you've downloaded. And then kind of coming back to what we talked about before in terms of what ad placement, you need to create a function that will occupy that placement. So there's kind of two main options with that. The first one is you could create a custom function that triggers a specific instance. Another option you could go for is if you have a separate screen for your game, a separate scene for your game over screen, you could you could initialize that when so you can trigger that when the scene is started. So if you transition to a game over screen, you could say on start play ad. That's an example. Then you need to initialize the advert. You'll see the logic for that on the next page. But that's basically saying like which advert is playing, and then the ID and reference for your specific game code essentially. And then the only other thing you need to do is actually give it the logic to show the advert. So it's just very straightforward. It's just advertisement, dot show. And yeah, you should be set. You should see this is your preview on the screen if you've set this up correctly. And you'll get something a little bit more fancy if you test it on a device. You'll get like some kind of jazzy music and a video transition. So from here, just real quick, you can see here the initialize text here. So obviously this would be your specific ID, and for the purposes of this, you don't need to worry about this as long as it's in test mode. You're fine. But some things that you want to think about is, again, coming back to the whole problem of like toxic business practices. A way to get around that is to try and be fair with your customers. So creating something like an ad counter is a really great way of making sure that the player isn't seeing an ad every time they die. Like that is bordering on exploitative. So having a counter which checks, like, let's say every 5 deaths, or every 3 or 4, you want to display an ad. That is a little bit more reasonable. And then to kind of continue from that, adding a timer to combine with it and to complement it, where if the player is really, really terrible and they die like 3 or 4 times in a row in the space of less than 30 seconds, if they then do the same thing again, that they don't see basically 2 adverts in the space of a minute, because that's probably not going to feel very good for the player. So you can, and these all, to be fair, these need like tweaking and refining to kind of see what is feasible in that time period in terms of seeing ads. Sorry, I don't know why I'm yawning so much. It's only like 3 p.m. So yeah, like those two in tandem, you can create some really, really, some reasonable ad placement. And as part of that as well, I would encourage you to actually playtest your ad placements. So see how quickly you can physically trigger the advertisements, and if it's taking you, let's say, 5 minutes to see an advert, then you probably need to scale it down. If you're seeing an advert every minute or less than a minute, you probably just need to bring those numbers up a little bit more. The other thing that you might want to think about is, and this is a pretty important one, is that like having a threshold for if a player does exceptionally well. So, you've got the low end thing basically saying, hey, if you how do I put this? If it's only been like less than 30 seconds, you shouldn't be seeing an ad. But on the other hand, if a player manages to play for 2 or 3 minutes uninterrupted, or let's say beat 4 or 5 levels, without dying or whatever, like you can just, rather than letting them die or lose and then letting them do another 5-minute sequence, you can scale that ad counter increment based on how well the player does. So one of the things I did for Shump to kind of mitigate this problem was that people were kind of just absolutely smashing the game. They either like horribly died at the start repeatedly, or they kind of got to like level 3, which is about 10 minutes of gameplay. So with a standardized counter, it would take, if they successfully played 10-minute sessions, you're looking at 30 minutes of gameplay without seeing an ad, which is is unsustainable. So having it so after you'd got past I think it was the first boss, once you'd beaten the first boss, you would see an advert the next time you died. And that was just a means of making sure that you literally didn't get, you got zilch out of players. So yeah, like these things take a long time to refine and make sure you get right. Um, you can't just whack it in at last second. Um, One other thing to think about as well is if you want to have the option to disable ads, and want to implement an in-app purchase, make sure that you've created a boolean that disables this function when that's not the case. Because I've had a situation before when I launched a game, uh, and that was a disaster because I launched it without the ability to disable ads. Um, you could pay to remove ads, but it wouldn't remove the ads. So for 100% golf, people were paying for the privilege of seeing adverts, which did not go down very well. It hammered my reviews for about 2 or 3 days whilst I was trying to frantically fix it in the feature period. So yeah, do spend a decent amount of time making sure that these systems are right. Some advanced mechanisms to consider. The first one is a pretty industry standard one. So reward ads. Reward ads are pretty valuable as a commodity. Basically, if you can get the player to consent to seeing an advert, it's worth a lot more in terms of its return. And yeah, like the thing you want to think about is how can you do it in a way that, as I said, isn't exploitative but is provides incentives for the player. So there's quite a few examples that exist out there. So there's passive examples. So let's say you've got a shop. You know, one thing that I usually do in my games is the one I don't like doing is I don't like putting in-app purchases to buy coins because I think that's obscene when people provide options for that because it's just like that's just a ticking time bomb for someone to have a kid or whatever that ends up buying a ridiculous number of coins. I don't like those as systems. Um, so having a button which you can push which lets you watch an ad, that's I think is fair, and that in turn gives you some coins, and as part of that you can implement some incentive mechanics. So for example, you could do stuff like when you've watched one ad, you could one reward ad, you could maybe afterwards offer them double the amount to watch the ad again, to watch another ad, or a multiplier, so to speak. Yeah, obviously, if your game is dependent on mechanics, which I'm trying to think of a way to put it. Basically, like what you don't want is a situation where the player can just absolutely spam the shop and break the economy for your game. But yeah, like I find that is like a nice passive option that doesn't necessarily require the player to engage with it if they don't want to. But there's definitely been players that have engaged with it from my previous games. I know because it's been the only implementation I've had in the projects, and I've seen the revenue from those. So yeah, it's worth considering to put in your games. On that front, a more intrusive way of doing it is you could have it that when you click on something that you want to buy and you can't afford it, you could have a pop-up that says, hey, you don't have enough coins, would you like to watch an advert to get X number of coins? That in combination with the banner might be a good shout. I wouldn't encourage having that second option without the additional shop button because most people are rational in the way that they can kind of see if and you're probably going to design your UI in a way that it's clear that something isn't purchasable from the store. So a lot of people might not click on the button to then get the pop-up. So thinking about like how you design the placement of that stuff is just really, really important. Another example that's a little bit more intrusive in game. This is kind of less passive and more active mechanisms. So things like in Shump, the game I designed, this isn't the example here, but I made it so if you had a power up, so I had like this ×2 speed power up that you could enable at any point. If you died and you still had a power up with you, you could watch an advert to keep that power up into your next run. there was another kind of a horror game, a shmup that I built a while ago, where if you lost all your lives, you could watch an ad to regain one of your lives back. Which, yeah, like those examples are kind of your more conventional setups. Usually with the lives one, I usually have it as just a one off per round, so you can't like blatantly just keep spamming it over and over and over again. Um, so yeah, there's plenty of options for reward ads in terms of implementation, and something I haven't mentioned up to this point, which I think is really really important, and I missed when I previously presented this. Um, the model that I'm describing isn't necessarily going to work for your game. So this is all something that you're going to have to refine and investigate for the project that you're trying to build. So what I mean by that is this model works for games that have either high frequencies of win states and high frequencies of lose states. So your kind of conventional either hyper casual or arcadey experiences where your players either dying or winning within the space of 30 seconds to a minute. At least one of those states occurring in that time period. Which is conducive to having lots of adverts. If you've got a puzzle game, for example, so something like, I don't know, Candy Crush or Tetris, the play sessions are going to be in excess of probably 5 minutes. And in that situation, the amount of adverts that a player is likely to see in that time is probably going to make that unsustainable, unless you're quite smart with things like reward ads or things integrated into the gameplay. So for those options, you might want to consider stuff like banner ads or, as I said, reward ads. So do your research, see how other games have done it in the field that you're wanting to kind of explore, because just trying this method and tacking it onto your project might be a spell for disaster. Carrying on from there, one thing for the reward ads I didn't mention, which is just on here, is you don't want to offer rewards every single time, because in time the player will kind of realize that it's just spitting out the same option every single time, and it'll kind of devalue them for the player. Spacing them out, having it that maybe when they get a high score, they get that pop up. In one of my games, Shot Dogs, which is kind of like your kind of old school Kitty Cannon games where you're kind of flinging an object across a level, and or Burrito Bison. I don't know if that's more modern reference. In that game, if you get a kind of certain distance on the level, you will get a pop-up that says, hey, you've just got your highest score yet. Do you want to double the points that you got from reaching that distance? And that'll give you some extra points for watching a reward ad. And I don't give them that every single time. It's usually every other time or something like that. Just because it keeps it as a treat rather than as a thing that just keeps happening over and over. One other thing you might want to think about is this is kind of a bit more of an experimental system, but I, for some of my games, have implemented like coffee cup voucher systems. So to kind of like thank the player for watching adverts, giving the player something for having done so. So like in the case of Shump, every third advert, you get a power up on the house basically for having watched those adverts, and that kind of serves as an incentive for the player to keep watching adverts. So not turning off their data so they don't see them, and just kind of gives them back something for them watching adverts. And in some weird cases, people might choose to watch adverts, let themselves die repeatedly, to get an edge. If you give them something that kind of affects gameplay. As I said, these things all take refinement, and you want to make sure that you're not being kind of exploitative to your customers. from there as well, one thing that I've integrated in all my games and has kind of seen consistent returns on is having a notification after the ad plays to explicitly say, hey, if you don't like adverts, you can pay to remove them. So give the player an option, an out from seeing these adverts. And placing that immediately after the advert is a means of catching them, when they're, like if a player, I've had quite a few people that will literally, the first opportunity they get to remove the ads, they will. So having that immediately afterwards is a way of ensuring that happens. And if you compare my first game, Narcissus, where I actively hid the ad button, compared to, Corporate Salmon, for example, it's a bit of a skewed example, but that game has had I think compared to Narcissus, which had about £140 or £200 of revenue, Corporate Salmon's had 3,000, and absolutely tons of people choose that option. So that's a good shout. And then the only other thing I'd mention as well is give the player a buffer when they start the game where they're not going to see adverts. This is a difficult line to straddle, because you don't want a situation where they play a session and then bail the moment they see an advert, or after their second time dying or something like that. But this is why you should play test, and you should refine these things. But yeah, having an artificial barrier that kind of pushes the ad placement back a little bit in the game is probably a good shout. Some other things to think about is, as I said, just real quick, I just want to kind of give you a rundown of the actual interface of the ad providers. This is Unity Ads here. This is an example of what my kind of interface for it looks like. So you can see the different revenues for the different projects. The way that this revenue is calculated is by a thing called ECPM, which is electronic clicks per, I think it's called millennia or something like that, or millium. I don't know what it is, but per 1,000 users or impressions, it will pay out an amount. And you can see a pretty clear correlation here that it's $10. There's 39,000 impressions, so that's paid out $400. So it's pretty much in line. You can see that in terms of the fill rate, so the fill rate is in reference to how many ads have been served. In this case, it's pretty good, although you can see it has somehow dropped from, I don't know how it's 100%, but one less than in the previous 30 days. I don't know what the situation is there, but if you've got an unreliable ad provider, this would be a little bit more sketchy, or high amount of traffic where it might slip through the net. So this stuff is really, really useful for kind of viewing engagement. You can go into all the analytics and stuff like that, which is really, really handy. One thing that you do have to keep in mind, and this is kind of coming back to not exploiting your customers. Thankfully, the European Union and kind of us have embraced digital rights for individuals. So GDPR means that inevitably, these ads that you're serving is using people's data, personal data, to serve them personalized ads. And to ensure that you comply with GDPR, you need to have a privacy policy for your games. So you can you can get access to those online. Obviously, you want to make sure that you go through that process, so you're not being held legally responsible, because you are dealing with people's personal data, and it is really important to make sure that you don't mishandle that. From there, another thing to think about is if you the ad provider that I use is with Unity Ads. Ironically, all of the games that I have made for mobile aren't made in Unity, but they're still willing to have my um, what's it called? Not my custom, maybe. Yeah, like they're still willing to have my business, even though I don't build my games in Unity. And yeah, they basically offer me like for me exclusively going with Unity. They offer me a bonus on top of whatever I make in terms of revenue. Yeah, which is really good. That's just an incentive for kind of sticking with a specific company. And depending on your setup, it might be that you're only able to build for one platform, or one integration for ads, or maybe you're just not technically able to do it. So actually giving away your exclusivity, is something you wouldn't have taken advantage of anyway. In the case of me, I've dealt with kind of different, like kind of waterfall integration stuff like that before. For some people, it's just a bit more straightforward to just go with to go with one provider. So it's definitely something to think about. And getting those exclusivity deals can offset the cost of getting a privacy policy and things like that quite easily. Yeah, and then other than that, thinking about like looking into different kind of models of ad implementation. So there's things like waterfall ad implementation. I think that might actually be kind of out of date now. But it's a constantly moving field, and like it's quite there's a lot of overlap into different into different industries. Like social media and stuff like that. If any of you've watched the what's it called, Social Dilemma, you can see a lot of parallels between what's happening here, obviously at like a much smaller and less malicious scale. But yeah, like there's definitely like a lot of overlap between those markets and industries. So yeah, there's a lot to learn, and you never know. You might be able to get a job if you do a good enough job, you might be able to get a job at a social media platform or a one of these larger studios that do this kind of thing. Yeah, so in terms of what I want you to kind of focus on for next week, figure out what your monetization model is. Remember that it's not a one size fits all situation. You need to kind of design your monetization strategy for your individual project. And obviously, as part of this assignment, it needs to be a free to play model. As part of that, get your basic ad infrastructure implemented, and get your timers, your functions, and all that stuff figured out. And then from there, just think about what you could design beyond the conventional stuff. So think about how you could do reward ads. Think about how you could do like timed incentives, maybe like daily rewards, stuff like that. And as I mentioned at the start, like one of the things that I really like about free to play design, or at least for mobile, is at least at the scale that I'm at, in terms of like one man team, which doesn't need to, as I said, I don't need to make a crazy amount of money for a game to be a success. My last game, 100% Golf, it was a 3-month development cycle and it made like $5,000. So like that for me as an individual, that's an acceptable amount. But yeah, like realistically, unfortunately, it kind of falls to us to try and be ethical in terms of how we integrate ads in our games. Inevitably, if you do so, you won't alienate your customers. And one of the things that I like about mobile design or free-to-play mobile design, is that you are kind of designing the game with monetization from like the foundation, rather than just what a lot of people do and a lot of studios do, which is basically just at the end of the project they just whack a price tag on it, and then inevitably just lower the price tag when they have a sale. Yeah, like that's pretty uninspiring in terms of implementation. So yeah, thinking about from the offset like how you're going to balance, respecting the customer's time and attention with what you need to be able to keep doing it, I find a little bit more
I don't say responsible, but like, I find that process a lot more interesting. And to be fair, as I said, let's put it this way. When I say responsible, I mean as in like an irresponsible way to do this would be to just chuck in ads at last minute, and do it in a really ham-fisted way. But if you're designing from the start with, in an ethical mindset, you are less likely to produce something that's exploitative and that still meets your needs. Yeah, so that's pretty much all I wanted to cover. You can find out more information online about how to kind of do integration for Unity. Yeah, hopefully that's been useful. And if you have any questions, just let me know.